Stefano again here this year. This is a follow-up to our Webisode 1 last year on youth boots, and today we're going to discuss a little bit more refinement in canting and setup for boots that are more appropriate to the fist level athlete. So goals for today, this is a short episode. We can't go into a lot of detail, but it's to give you a structure and an approach to sorting out boots for this level of athlete in a way that's organized, clear, and reproducible. As you'll see in a moment, we're going to link the setup of these boots to the planes of balance and the planes of motion, so that what you do on hill and what the athlete does technically is linked in your mind to how you set up the equipment. You can probably see here on the desk, we have a few assortment of shims. Some are angled, and for lean shim here, we're going to go through in relation to the planes of movement how you can adjust the athlete's alignment and balance. But what's most important is what I have in my hand. And I'm sure that everybody has a bag full of these things from being on the road, and the hotel key card is going to become your key alignment tool on hill. Lastly, you may notice that I'm wearing a NASCAR shirt. That's no accident, and you may ask, how's that related to skiing? Well, it comes down to alignment. And in car racing, the cars are aligned in 3 dimensions: toe, caster, and camber. And depending on the car and the racing situation and the amount of grip available to the tires, that alignment may be in fractions of millimeters. And that's often what it takes to win. We need to do the same thing in skiing. And if at this stage you're still not convinced that alignment's a core part of success in ski racing, then you're wrong. Okay, so the first plane of motion is vertical, and we don't think about that enough on the ski hill, but it's actually a key part of how we manage pressure on the ski and work the equipment as a spring. And I'm not going to talk too much about vertical range of motion or vertical motion, but the thing to think about always in boots, even for elite athletes, is the boot has to be flexible enough so the ankle can work as a joint. If the ankle's locked, you really have restricted vertical movement. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more with fore-aft setup, but one thing I want you to think about is that if the athlete technically doesn't know how to move the center of mass ahead of the feet, the boot can appear to be too stiff. If the athlete isn't set up fore and aft and can't get to the front of the boot can appear to be too stiff. So one of the pearls I want to leave with you, one of the pitfalls is you can have a boot that's appropriate flex, but if the athlete can't get to the front of the boot, either because their fore-aft balance isn't correct or their technique is lacking in their ability to send the mass ahead of the feet at the start of the turn, then it doesn't matter how soft the boot is, the athlete can't get to the front of it and it's not going to work. So one of the risks is softening a boot to try and solve a problem that's not a boot flex problem. Okay, so we're going to talk about fore-aft setup, fore-aft balance, fore-aft range of motion. But before we get to the boot, let's remember that there's a platform that we're standing on, and that can impact our fore-aft setup. I just brought this ski out and this binding setup as an example, but I want you to note that the lifters in the rear and the front and the relative thickness of the AFD and the rear platform here, it's pretty equal. And so there's not a lot of delta angle, and delta angle just refers to the fore-aft angle that's built into the binding. If you look at a lot of World Cup equipment, it's all similar to this. It's relatively flat. There's a number of reasons for that, but one of the key things is you try and do your fore-aft work in the boot and reduce this as a variable. If you compare this to a lot of retail bindings, a lot of retail product has quite a bit of delta angle, quite a bit of fore-aft ramp going on, and that can actually be detrimental to fore-aft balance, fore-aft mobility, moving the mass ahead of the feet, and in particular in women, it can sit their center mass back. So just look here to start. Okay, so now we've got the boot board or the Zeppa out of the shell. And I think everybody that looks at the boot can appreciate there's a little bit of ramp, there's a little bit of fore-aft ramp in the boot. And that's actually called ramp angle. And you can see in this particular Zeppa that there's a few degrees of ramp there. And depending on the manufacturer, it can vary between 2 to 3 degrees all the way up to 6 or 7 degrees. So it's another variable that's worth knowing about and to actually measure in the boots that your athletes are using so you know where they're at. What's their baseline? So how do you know this stuff? Well, you can talk to your manufacturing rep, or you can just measure. And right here, I've got a tilt box, which is a great little tool called a digital inclinometer. There's a number of different brands. I've zeroed it on the table here so we know what our baseline is. And if I move this to the Zeppa, then as predicted by Lang, this is about 3 degrees of ramp. The key point is you can't guess, you gotta know, so measure everything. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about fore-aft setup. We're gonna look at the forward lean here. We don't have a lot of time to discuss all the biomechanics around why have they chosen this 14, 15, 16 degrees, but it varies very little between manufacturers, which should tell you something. If you verticalize a boot, and I'm gonna mention this as just a pearl, if you straighten a boot up, you're really in danger of taking pressure off the part of the ski that needs to work. The forward lean angle of the boot keeps the center of the knee mass roughly over the ball of the foot, and the ball of the foot transmits energy to the AFD, which is right around the center of the ski. So if you straighten a boot, you're taking the pressure off the working part of the ski. Another little piece of equipment, this often ends up in the bottom of the boot box and no one knows what it's for, the forward lean shim. One of the key things to individualize the fit and the setup for your athletes is to look at where their calf bulk is. Guys tend to have a higher calf, and so they end up with a gap here, and they can actually stand up straighter in the boot than the forward lean angle is designed. So you need to fill that gap in guys and put a forward lean shim in here. This is not shoving you forward or changing your angle. It's just filling a space in. In women that have a lower calf and a fuller calf, you may find that you need to take this out. So let's review just these basic fore-aft setup factors. One is the ski. What's the delta angle on the ski? How much fore-aft ramp is there built into the binding? And then we know there's fore-aft ramp built into the Zeppa or the boot board. And then there's this forward lean, and then there's the forward lean shim. So Matt, how do I mix all these things into the right recipe for the athlete? Well, this is where you need experience and testing, and you need to know where you're starting with all these things by measuring. And the difference in athletes really boils down to their particular anatomy. What's the ratio between their foot length and their tibial length and their femoral length? What's the range of motion of the involved joints? Where's the boot mounted on the ski? What's their calf bulk like? And then what's the quality or particular biomechanics of their movement pattern? In other words, what's their technique like? And you have to take all these things into account and adjust one variable at a time and test. I can't give you a solution for every situation, but just a pearl here to discuss. If the binding has too much ramp in it, in other words, the binding plus the boot gives the athlete too much ramp angle underneath the foot, that can paradoxically move their hips back. So you can use shims, 2 millimeters at a time, and stack them under the toe piece of the binding. I'm putting them under the boot here, but you can stack them under the toe piece of the binding to take some ramp out. And this can help the athlete get their hips back up over their feet. This is particularly a problem in young athletes that have a very long femur. So let's talk about rotational setup a little bit. And what I mean by that is, what's the natural position of the feet when you walk? Well, it's a little bit toed out in most people. What's the natural position of the feet when you ski? Well, it's parallel. So we're forcing ourselves to wind up a little bit or become relatively toed in when we ski. And that goes all the way up the leg and can change the way the knee moves. Now, how's it related to boots? Well, we've got a couple manufacturers represented here, and it may be news to you to know that the relative toe out angle is different in these boots. So for instance, in the Atomic here, this is a 0 degree boot. So the way the boot is molded relative to the toe and heel lug, it's all 0 degrees. In other words, the feet are pointed dead straight. I'm going to compare that to Lang or Rossi here, and depending on the boot size, the angle of the toe and heel lug is actually offset a little bit from the boot angle itself, resulting in about 1.5 degree toe out. It sounds small, but it actually makes a difference in terms of which way the knees move when you flex. So again, like fore-aft setup, you need to know, you need to measure or talk to your manufacturer. Good, so one other rotational factor to consider, and there are others, is the axis of the cuff pivot points. It's difficult to show you on here, but if you put a finger on the rivet on both sides of the cuff and you get a sense of what the axis is, it's often not perpendicular to the boot. In other words, on different boots, the cuff will flex different directions. It can flex in a little bit, it can flex straight forward, and it can flex out. So you need to consider which way that causes the knee to thrust. Will the knee move in as you flex forward? Will it move straight ahead, or will it move out? And depending on an athlete's build, they may interact with different boots in a different way. The only way to sort that out is to measure the cuff, look at the cuff axis, and look at which way the athlete's knee tracks in different equipment. Okay, so the key thing to think about with the upper cuff is, depending on the design of the cuff and the shape of it and the material and where the axis is, where these pivot points are relative to each other, the cuff has the capacity to move this way in rotation when you flex it forward. And varying brands have varying degrees of rotation. Let's talk about lateral setup. And there's a couple components here. Number one, most important, is how stiff is the boot laterally? A boot that's very soft laterally, you don't have to worry about particularly precise setup because the equipment's not that precise. A boot that gets stiffer, the stiffer it gets, the more precise you have to be about your cuff alignment and your canting. And we're going to explain that those two things are different. Okay, first of all, cuff alignment. Cuff alignment is this adjustment right here. This is often mislabeled as canting from the manufacturers, but it's cuff alignment. And what that does is it aligns the cuff in either direction to match the shape of the lower leg. What's the point of that? Well, the point is so the athlete can stand on a flat ski. It has very minimal impact on the position of the knee relative to the working edge of the ski. So to be clear, cuff alignment is adaptive. It gets the boot to match the anatomy of the athlete so they can run on a flat ski relaxed. How does cuff alignment differ from canting? Well, canting changes angles underneath the boot, and traditionally, at the dawn of the plastic boot in the 1970s, canting was accomplished by temporarily shimming and then grinding the bottom of the boot sole to the angle desired. These days we tend to use canting shims, and I've stacked a couple together here so that you can appreciate they're thinner on this side and thicker on this side. This is about a total of 3 degrees. So how and why would you adjust canting? Well, there's a number of indications, from how much grip the ski needs to develop, what the snow surface is like, what the athlete's particular biomechanics are like, and what the desired feel is for the athlete, particularly at the top of the turn in terms of grip. If you wanted to move the knee inside a little bit, in other words, tilting the whole boot from the bottom up, and I'm just going to demonstrate here, you'd use a canting shim to test, thick side, outside. If you needed more leverage or more grip, or you had a particularly knock-kneed athlete, you might want to move the center of the knee mass outside. In other words, tip the boot this way. And so you'd slide the canting shim thick side inside. So what do you do if you don't have a couple $100 worth of canting shims? Well, that's where this hotel key card comes into play, because you can cut these up and you can tape them underneath the boot, and you can stack a bunch to get the canting angles that you might want. Or you can stack a bunch to lift the forefoot and change the fore-aft balance. So to a working coach, this is your friend. So we've done a brief review of setup in regard to 4 planes of motion: vertical, fore-aft, rotational, and lateral. But we haven't given you a solution. There's no cookbook for this. There's no algorithm. There's no perfect recipe. All your kids are built differently and they're on different equipment. So the first thing you need to do is measure, establish a baseline, and understand the athlete's technique and the fact that their technique may be impacted by their setup. And that's a key point. Not everything you see on hill is technique. A lot of what you're going to see as the equipment gets stiffer and the athletes get faster and create more loading, what you're seeing is alignment and sometimes misalignment.